Thy age, great Caesar, has restored to squalid fields the plenteous grain, given back to Rome's almighty Lord our standards torn from Parthian fane. The glorious name of Latium spread to where the sun illumes the east, from where he seeks his western bed. While Caesar rules, no civil strife shall break our rest, nor violence rude, nor rage that whets the slaughtering knife and plunges wretched towns in feud. And we on feast and working tide, while Bacchus' bounties freely flow, our wives and children at our side, first paying heaven the prayers we owe, shall sing of chiefs whose deeds are done, as wont our sires to flute or shell, and Troy and Chryses and the son of Venus on our tongues shall dwell. This is Horace, is the great poet of Rome, in his odes lauding the Roman Empire as never seen before, never will be seen again. And the thing that pops out to me in this ode in particular is the divine right of the Roman Empire to
Right,
bring about peace on the earth, to quell wars. In fact, if you were to lay this down next to something like Psalm 46, for example, they sound almost exactly alike. But
right.
instead of God being the one to bring wars to an end and be still and know that I am God, Horace is essentially saying, be still and know that I am Rome. And
Right.
there is no greater way to sum up the Roman Empire than that. The Pax Romana, the might of Rome, the mandate of heaven for Rome to rule the world. And so you might be getting a sense that we're back in our Empire series, which we are. We left off our Empire series at Holy Week. We did a little bit with Pontius Pilate, but basically skipped the Roman Empire, which is what the whole series is leading up to.
Which turns
So
out to be important.
it turns out to be a pretty important biblical empire. And so today, as you're listening, and next week, we've got two parts on the Roman Empire. I mean, we definitely couldn't do Rome in one episode.
Right.
And two episodes is really going to be pushing it. Of course, there are podcasts out there that have done 500 episodes on the Roman Empire. We didn't want to be those guys either. So we're going to do our best to get Rome into two episodes here.
And particularly focusing on, and the way we'll do it is particularly focusing on the Roman Empire as it impacts the birth of Christianity, shortly before the time of Jesus, and then in the time of the early church. And I think focusing on that in two episodes will give us a really good feel for Rome and its interaction with the biblical events.
Yeah. So our question, like with all these empires, is what do you need to know about Rome to understand the Bible? The question is a lot. That there's a
Yeah.
lot that you need to know about Rome to understand the Bible. And so maybe let's set the stage on Rome. What is Rome, and what are the deliverances of Rome? And that question is actually very hard to answer apart from Greece. Greece and Rome are blended now in our cultural awareness. We're a country. The United States is modeled after the legacy of Greece and Rome, and
Yeah.
many
Greco-Roman
countries have been
tradition. Right.
before us. But that actually was pretty original to Greece and Rome. That's not a later fusion. In fact, there's a really great debate over Greece and Rome, Greece versus Rome, featuring Boris Johnson, former prime minister. This is before he was prime minister. Maybe you know about Boris Johnson. He's a classic scholar. That's his original
Hmm.
training at Oxford. Brilliant. Has been known to recite, the first 30 lines of the Iliad in Greek in interviews and things. He's taking the side of Greece. And then Mary Beard, who's one of the great classicists in the world today, is taking the side of Rome. And I love this quote from Boris Johnson. He's arguing for Greece, and he says, the Greeks gave us philosophy, poetry, history, tragedy, comedy, biography, the Olympic Games, rational scientific inquiry, our modern system of government. And what else did they give us? They gave us Rome. Rome was really the creation of Greece. So, but what's interesting here is Rome actually knew this. So Horace, as we quoted earlier, Horace in one of his epistles says, kind of famously, captive Greece took captive her savage captor and brought the arts to rustic Latium. Basically, Greece was subdued militarily,
Right.
but it took Rome captive culturally. So you have this
Right.
great fusion of Greek culture, which we've covered in a previous episode. You think the golden age of philosophy and art and oratory and all of these things in Greece
Right.
in the fourth and fifth century BC. Those things actually are the things that become the cultural center of Rome. What Rome brings to the table is military might and organization and empire building that the world had never seen before. And that's one of the reasons why the Roman Empire
Hmm.
is such an incredible empire in history is they were able to combine this high culture of the Greeks with the conquering and administration that somebody like Alexander the Great had on the front end, but never actually got to rule. You know,
Right.
Alexander, as we talked about, he conquered the known world, but then died. Rome conquers the whole world and then rules.
Yes, and I think you're making a really important point for readers of the Bible, because as you read the Old Testament, you get this sense that empires come and empires go. You know, whether it's the Sumerians and then the Akkadians, and you get the Babylonians and Assyrians, the Neo-Babylonians, the Neo-Assyrian. You know, you get this sense that one empire comes, they get defeated, and they go. That's not really what's happening here. There's something more subtle happening here. It's not just that Greece was an empire, they got defeated. Now Rome is an empire. It was necessary for the biblical scheme for Greece and Rome to both exist. That sheds a little light on something you and I were talking about, is the Rome appears first in the Bible in the prophecies of Daniel. And we read Daniel as empires come, empires go, simply predictive, but it's more than predictive. It the empires in a row that Daniel predicts are each necessary and contribute to the ones after them.
Well, the prophecies in Daniel are really fascinating on this point because Rome, the history of Rome actually begins before you think it begins. We think Rome, we think Caesar, you know, we think of the Republic even if you know a little bit, but Rome is older than that. Rome is founded, the traditional date of the founding of Rome is in 753 BC. So that's a long time. I mean, think
That's
that's when
right,
Israel in the north is being conquered by the Assyrians essentially.
right,
Isaiah is writing. So this
right.
is way before we get a sense of Rome as a world player. And there's two founding myths of Rome. The first one is Romulus and Remus, who are basically for various reasons they are orphaned. They are raised by a wolf. There's the very famous statue of the two boys and the mother she wolf, and they're taken in and they're raised and they end up being conquerors. And Romulus kills Remus, or in some of the stories, Remus is just killed in a battle, and Romulus founds Rome. And from there, he becomes the first king. Another popular version of this is that in the Trojan War, you have a Trojan whose name is Aeneas. This is where you get the Aeneid,
Hmm.
which is kind of the myth, the founding epic of Rome. It's modeled after the Iliad and the Odyssey. Aeneas, who's a hero in Troy, he escapes from the burning of Troy, carries his dad on his shoulder. There's a real famous painting of this, and takes his son, and they go to Italy, they go to Rome, and he founds the city there. And so Rome is founded on the heroic ideals of Aeneas, and it's supposed to be kind of a second Troy, you know, in a
Right.
sense.
And ends
So
up conquering the conqueror, so to speak. You
yeah,
know,
and regardless of whether this happened, you know, if that was kind of one of those, well, Greece conquered Troy, but actually in a roundabout way, Rome then goes back and conquers Greece, or
right.
you have this mythical founding where these boys are maybe the sons of the god Apollo or something like that. You
Uh-huh.
know, we all have these kind of founding myths about our culture. But what's interesting about that is you have a long period of time where Rome is kind of a city state like Athens or like any of these other places, and they have kings. But what's interesting about Rome is finally they throw off their king, and in the late 6th century they become a republic. And it's not really until about 150 years after that that they become dominant in Italy, and then
Right.
by the mid 3rd century you have Rome as the dominant power in Italy. You have the wars against Carthage, Hannibal,
Hmm.
think coming over the Alps with his elephants, all of that. They become a world superpower shortly after this. So in the book of Daniel, one of the things that's interesting about Rome is in chapter 2, you have this statue that Nebuchadnezzar sees that has these 4 layers. And the head is of gold, and that's Babylon, and they're going to get conquered and conquered. And then the feet are feet of iron that are mixed with clay. And this empire is different than the others. And it's at this time in chapter 2 where this stone that isn't cut with human hands comes and smashes into the iron feet of the statue. And the statue is disintegrated, and the stone grows to encompass the whole world. So you're thinking to
Hmm.
yourself, wow, that's okay, that's interesting. There's something big that's going to happen, when that fourth empire is here. Of course, Nebuchadnezzar basically takes the vision and says, not on, not on my watch.
Not on
It's
my
not happening in
watch.
my lifetime. So, I don't need to learn
Not
that.
too worried. Yeah.
And the book of Daniel progressively interprets this same vision over and over and over again through the
Hmm.
prophecy. So in Daniel chapter 7, again, you see a very similar kind of interpretation of history where you have these four empires. Of course, now in chapter 7, this is taking place, before chapter 6. It's really right at the end of the time that Babylon is falling. He's reminding everybody, hey, God predicted this was going to happen even in the heyday of Babylon. There's going to be two more empires that come. Then there's going to be this fourth beast. And it says he is exceedingly strong and terrifying with iron teeth and 10 horns, interestingly enough, 10 horns. And this is when, in the midst of this vision, when you get to this beast, the heavens open and the thrones are placed, and the Son of Man inherits the kingdom from the Ancient of Days. So, in both of these visions, what you see is there's going to be this kingdom that's mightier than all the other kingdoms that have ever been.
Hmm.
And it's right in the midst of that kingdom that God is going to send his Messiah, his Son of Man,
Right.
his anointed one, who is going to take the kingdoms of the earth. In the midst of this really powerful kingdom, there's going to be a swap, and the kingdoms of the earth are going to be ruled over by the kingdom of heaven. Well, this is ominous. Okay, this is
Right.
interesting. Every person reading this should say, "I wonder what this kingdom's going to be. I wonder what that's going to be like when that happens." Fast forward to our story for today. That's the first century.
Right. Exactly. And you do see all this coming together from Daniel centuries before. And our story picks up in 100 BC. So 100 years before the birth of Christ, a man named Julius Caesar is born. And Julius Caesar is born into the Roman Republic. And what do we mean by that? Basically, the Roman Republic is ruled by the Senate, and the Senate appoints what are called consuls, and usually there are two consuls for each term, and they would be like our executive branch of government. They would do the executive things that needed to be done, and they were just considered to be just regular citizens like the senators. They were just first amongst equals, and then when their term was done, they were applauded as great public servants, and someone else would become the consul. Well, into that scheme is comes Julius Caesar, and he's a man of uncommon uh, ambition. And he has another consul with him, another man who's ambitious, whose name was Pompey. Pompey was about the same age as Caesar, and they both go off conquering. So they're consuls, so they take over the armies and they go conquering. And Caesar goes to the west of Italy. He goes out to what's Gaul, which is France today, and Hispania, which is Spain. And you may remember that he even invades Britain and goes into Britain. Pompey goes the other direction. He goes east. And one of the things that we should know about him is he conquered Syria in 64 BC and he conquered Judea in 63. And so the Jewish people at the time come under the Roman sway in 63 BC. And so you have these two great leaders in this Republican form of government, and they're both ambitious, and they look at each other and they say, I'd like to be wielding the sole power. And so the Republic itself is coming to an end here. That whole system is going to be caught up in the battle between these two men.
Yeah, Caesar's story is interesting because he excels, as you did in the Roman Empire, in conquering, as you mentioned. He's a general, he is a commander of troops. He goes to Gaul and writes the Gallic Wars, which is kind of a standard. If you take in Latin, it's a standard text. Everybody's suffered
Right.
through some of the Gallic Wars. But Caesar's actually a really amazing writer. He's a fantastic, charismatic leader.
Hmm.
He supposedly kills a million Gauls for the empire. I mean, he's this swashbuckling kind of charismatic military leader that really does embody what Rome is. If you think about Rome in the Republic, essentially what happens is it outstrips its own potential through conquering. So in order to pay the budget, they've got to conquer people. They go and conquer people. Now they've got all these troops. They got thousands and thousands of troops that they got to resettle. They have these conquered people. And so there's fractures in the Republic on how to manage this giant empire. And so you get some really interesting things happening domestically. You get
Right.
the breakdown of their system when you have people like Catiline with this plot to try and kill off the top level of the leadership, and
Right.
Cicero, the great orator, foils the plot. Will later be, kind of involved in the plot against Caesar. I mean, there's a lot of turmoil in Rome, and so essentially what happens is after Caesar conquers the Senate, he becomes part of the triumvirate, the first triumvirate, which is a three-leader system with Pompey
Uh-huh.
and Crassus. The Senate, after he has conquered and is coming back, they order him to lay down his military commission and they order him to return to Rome. This turns out to be a big mistake because Caesar is not the guy that is going to be ordered to do anything. So what he does is he does come back to Rome, but he brings his army with him, which you're not allowed to do. You're not allowed to bring an army
Right.
into Rome. You're not even allowed to carry a sword in Rome.
Right.
And so Caesar comes back to Rome. He crosses the Rubicon, which is kind of the divider. So this is where we get the term, crossing the Rubicon, point of no return. Comes back to Rome. Civil war breaks out. Basically, he is elected a dictator. This is kind of an interesting historical fact. The Romans had this kind of pressure release valve that when things went poorly in the empire, they could elect somebody dictator, be kind of our version of the unitary executive, where somebody
Martial
can
law.
take power, declare martial law, ride out
Right.
a crisis. But anyway, you could be elected dictator for 10 years and then you had to step down and give it back. And this was done
Hmm.
several times in the empire. Caesar, though, is elected dictator in 46 BC. In February of 44 BC, he extends it to being dictator for life. And in March of that same year in 44, he's killed in the famous scene with the senators stabbing him and et tu, Brute and all of that. So this plunges the empire into chaos for a while. And part of the reason is because of the way that the Romans did secession. So don't think republic, you're just going to vote for the next person. Something between a monarchy and a republic is the way that they
Hmm.
did succession. And this becomes a very, very key thing to describe the world that Jesus is born into is who is going to succeed Caesar.
Exactly. Typically, you would have your son, but in those days, it was very common to find your successor and then adopt them as your son. Now, they might still be in your family, and that's exactly what Caesar did. Caesar had an heir, and this would just be his heir to his fortune, but it also was heir to his political power. And he had a nephew named Octavian. And so he adopted Octavian as his son and heir. Well, when Caesar was killed by the senators, and you can understand why, they saw that this was going to be the end of the republic itself, that the Senate would no longer have control. He was going to be dictator for life. And so it was senators that killed Caesar, thinking this was the end of the republic. And they were right, it was. And so they killed him, they fled. So his heir Octavian and one of Caesar's great generals, Mark Antony, come together and pledge to avenge him. And so the two of them raise their legions. They basically are the inheritors of the legions who were loyal to Julius Caesar. They raised their legions and they went after Brutus and Cassius and the other conspirators, and they defeated them. After they defeated them, instead of coming back, and this is what the Senate was hoping for, is they would come back, they would be heroes for restoring peace, they would lay down their arms, and they would say, okay, Senate, you take on and continue with the Republic the way it was before. But they didn't. Instead, they look at each other and they say, this town's not big enough for both of us. And so they realize they're not going to lay down their power. And so they split up. And so Octavian stays in the regions of Italy and starts to raise legions. And Mark Antony goes into the provinces, most notably Egypt, a very rich possession of Rome. And he begins to bring money in and build ships and build legions. And so the Republic, unbeknownst to the senators, is over because at some point, it's not going to be Julius Caesar, but it's going to be Mark Antony or Octavian who effectively become and take on the mantle of dictator for life, actually, even more, emperor of Rome.
Well, most of us probably know how the story goes from here. Mark Antony goes to Egypt. His girlfriend Cleopatra, who had been Julius Caesar's girlfriend, they're losing. She allows the snake to bite her. They lock eyes across the ships, and she dies. And then Mark Antony loses the battle, and Octavian has triumphed. He's not only Caesar's heir, he's now consolidated power in Rome. He's voted. Augustus is his name in the Senate, and that's how we know him, Caesar Augustus. And he rules. And this is one of the things that really shapes the Roman Empire is he rules essentially from 27 BC all the way to 14 AD. And this is big because it allows him enough time to really unify the Roman Empire. He's able to bring a set of rulers into the provinces. He's able to get their finances in order. They say about Augustus, he found Rome a city of brick and turned it into a city of marble. He's able to
Right,
build temples. He's able to unify the culture. So he commissions people like Horace and Virgil and these other writers to create a distinctly Roman mythology around his reign. And because of that, because of his long rule and because of his ability as an administrator, really one of the shrewdest politicians and administrators that has ever lived, he's able to bring about the cornerstones of the Roman Empire, which will last for 1,000 years after this.
right,
And that's the world that Jesus is born into. So, to fast forward into biblical history from the Old Testament, when the Old Testament ends, you have prophecies about Rome, but you have the Maccabees, you have the Greeks, you have the
right,
Romans. By the time Luke's gospel opens and you read Caesar issues a decree, now we're talking about Caesar Augustus.
right. One thing we ought to stop here and point out, because I think it's easy to miss, is this title Augustus. Julius Caesar, uh, later in his life, as he became successful, he also kind of fostered a myth about his origins, so to speak. He floated this story, which I don't know if he believed it or if it was good PR, but that he was the son of a god. And that wasn't a crazy thing in Roman mythology, that a god might actually take a human woman and the son then would be a great hero. Think Greek legends like Hercules, a demigod. But he had fostered the idea that he was actually the son of a god. And so Augustus, that title, Augustus, is a kind of semi-divine title. You are august. It was a title that was voted to him saying, we think you're more than a man. And so you get this idea that the Roman emperors, and you'll see it very pronounced as time goes on, but even with Julius and Octavian, is that they're not merely mortals, that they're a little bit more than a mortal. And
Mm-hmm.
so I think that's going to come into play in an interesting way. But the idea that the emperor, who in these times was in the Caesar family, so they were called Caesars, that these emperors were actually related to the gods. They deserved obedience, and they were higher than mortal men. And as you said, Cole, Augustus seemed to put the proof to that because he actually brought the empire together. He was able to maintain power for 41 years, and he brought peace on the Roman frontiers, and he really brought great prosperity to Rome.
Yeah, you think about the Pax Romana, which is the peace of Rome, which is what Horace is
Mm-hmm.
talking about in the beginning in his ode to Rome. That for life in the empire, of course, it wouldn't be great by today's standards, but by those standards, relatively free from war, roads that went across the empire. If you were a Roman citizen, you lived in a rule of law. Essentially, you had certain privileges that nobody in the world had ever had. Certain places were exempt from taxation for what they'd done for the empire. If you were a soldier, you got land that you could live and
Hmm.
farm on and start a family. I mean, this was really the dawn of a new age in world history. And part of the center of this was all of this had been brought about, at least in the way that they framed it. All of this had been brought about by the emperor, by Julius Caesar, now by Augustus. And so you can see, as you're saying, why people would be content to worship the emperor. The emperor had given them everything. He had given them
Right.
peace. He'd given them stability. He'd given them dignity. He'd given them citizenship. And so the fastest growing religion in Jesus's day is worship of the emperor.
Right.
And we have to think of this a little bit more culturally, probably, than we think of religiously. It was your civic duty to pay
Right.
homage to the emperor. This encompassed your worship. You would go to the temple and you would worship the emperor by giving or by going through rituals or being initiated into these
Hmm.
secret religions, mystery religions, into the cults. It would be attached to your status as a tradesman. It would be attached to your schedule. I mean, all of this is wrapped up in their idea of kind of worship of the emperor, to the point that in Jesus's day, or at least when Jesus was born in the reign of Augustus, you have these coins that have Caesar's face on it that say the Son of God. So
Yep.
the titles for Augustus, Son of God, Savior, so the word
The
soter,
savior of Rome. Yeah.
that would be a title that would be applied to the emperor. He's the savior of Rome. Julius Caesar, actually, even before he died, had a statue in one of the temples, the great temples of Rome, that's under the inscription "Deo Invicto," which means God unconquered. So you
Hmm.
get the sense that they really have a high view of the emperor, and so for Augustus to call himself son of God was a commonplace in
Right.
the ancient world. Now, I want to shift us over for a minute to say, if you have this happening in Rome, kind of big picture, what's happening in Judea? So, as you mentioned, if
Well,
we pick up the thread, Judea has been conquered, but the Romans don't always like to rule from Rome. They like to rule locally.
this is one of the genius moves of Augustus. He's not the first to do it, but he did it so effectively. If you govern, or you're trying to govern an empire as large as Rome had after Julius Caesar and Pompey did all their conquests, you have to get your border guards and pacify the border. In other words, there's nobody invading you at the moment. But even more important, you want to avoid rebellions of conquered people. And so governing was a big deal. And this is part of the Pax Romana. What Augustus did, we would not consider to be just because he used power to impose peace. But what he did was effective governance from the Roman point of view. So there would be various kings, or there would be Roman governors who had tremendous power to extract taxes and to rule these areas subject to the emperor. Well, in Judea, the Jews were notoriously hard to govern, as the Greeks found out and the Romans saw. And so when a man named Herod approached Octavian and said, "Look, I fought for Mark Antony, but I'll also be very loyal to you. And did I mention that I'm a Jew and my dad was really well connected politically? And you know what? You should let me run Judea for you. I'll get you a ton of taxes. And by the way, did I mention those people love me because I'm a fellow Jew?" And so Octavian took a chance and said, "You know, you seem like an enterprising young fellow. I'm going to make you king of the Jews. You will be king of Judea. Now, of course, you're subject to me, the emperor, but I'll give you authority there as long as you keep it running." And this was part of the way Augustus governed. But for the Jews, it ended up having this sort of, they would consider him half-breed Jewish, secular Jew at best, ruling over them. So he came in and consolidated his power. He killed the rest of the Hasmonean family, think Maccabees, and that family, and he consolidated power. He wasn't loved, but he did bring order by using the Roman troops. And so you had Herod the Great the king of the Jews. And that's really the most immediate thing that the Jews knew about Rome was the power of Rome wielded through Herod the Great.
Yeah, we covered in the episode on that we did during Holy Week on Pontius Pilate. We covered a little bit of how Herod came to be who he was. Father, as you mentioned, his lineage is really important. He's an Idumean. He's kind of half Jewish, but he marries a Hasmonean princess. The guy knows how to consolidate power.
Right,
But he lives until the time that you remember the story. He dies, and he's put all the babies to death, and then Mary and Joseph are able to return from Egypt.
right,
And after that, Rome rules Judea directly because it proves to be so difficult to rule. So Jesus is born into a time when you have kind of local rulership. He dies at a time when under Pontius Pilate you have a Roman ruler appointed to rule
right,
over Judea. But the fascinating thing is when Jesus is born, you essentially have these two titles in play. Caesar is the son of God. He is the
right,
son of a god. He is deified. Caesar is Lord. And locally, you have Herod, who is known as the king of the Jews. So what's interesting and where we'll kind of bring up to the edge of our story before we stop for next time is Jesus is born the Son of God when there is currently a quote unquote Son of God. And
right,
Jesus is born the King of the Jews when there is a quote unquote King of the Jews already in play. And so what you
right,
can see is the prophecy of Daniel playing out, that it's actually in the midst of this great empire. It's in the midst of another son of God and another king of the Jews, that the true son of God, the true king of the Jews, is going to establish a kingdom right up underneath the most powerful kingdom that the world has ever seen that will become the eternal kingdom. And this is where we'll get to how this plays out in the early church, but it's no coincidence that if you go to Rome today, what you're going to see is the mixture of the might of the Roman Empire that has been
right,
superseded by the church, right? Most
right.
of Rome today is what you go to see is the Vatican, the Christian art, the Christian history, the reliefs, everything that's there that is part of Christian history, to the point that it's actually difficult to tell at sometimes whether Rome is Rome, as in the Roman Empire, or Rome as in the church at Rome. And that's actually very significant to the way that this story was designed to play out.
Exactly. I mean, I think you said it very well. Jesus is born the Son of God when there's already a Son of God. He's born King of the Jews when there's already a King of the Jews. And it really makes me wonder, how is this going to play out for the Christians and the early church? But I suppose that's the subject of episode 2.